They laughed at me because I refused to sell my farm. Then they begged for it. My name is Samuel Walker, and if there is one thing I have learned after spending more than 50 years working the same stretch of Missouri farmland, it is this. People are very quick to tell you what your land is worth, but very few of them ever understand what it means to you. To them, my farm was just 160 acres of aging pasture, weathered fences, a creek that flooded every spring, and an old white farmhouse whose porch leaned just enough to make visitors nervous. To me, it was the place where my father taught me to plant corn with my bare hands before I was tall enough to see over the tractor's steering wheel. It was where my mother baked fresh apple pies every Saturday while the smell drifted across the yard and somehow made every hard day's work feel worthwhile. It was where my grandfather was buried beneath a giant oak tree overlooking the western pasture after making me promise that no matter how difficult life became, I would never treat the farm like it was just another piece of property. This land carried our family before you were born, he told me shortly before he passed away. If you take care of it, someday it will carry you too. At the time, I was just a young man who thought old people spoke in riddles. I had no idea those words would one day become the reason I refused an offer that almost everyone in the county believed I was foolish to reject. The trouble began during one of the hardest economic seasons our town had seen in decades. Farms were disappearing almost every month because crop prices had fallen while fuel, fertilizer, machinery, and taxes climbed higher than anyone could remember. Families who had worked the same fields for generations were quietly packing their belongings into pickup trucks and leaving before sunrise because they couldn't bear letting neighbors watch them lose everything. Every week another auction sign appeared beside another gravel road, and every week another farm became part of a growing development owned by companies that had never planted a single seed in their lives. The town slowly changed before our eyes. Fields that once grew corn and soybeans became warehouses, parking lots, and concrete foundations. Some folks called it progress. Others called it survival. I simply called it heartbreaking. Then one afternoon, a black luxury SUV rolled into my driveway carrying 3 men wearing expensive suits that looked completely out of place beside muddy boots and hay bales. They introduced themselves politely and explained that they represented a development company interested in purchasing farmland throughout the county for a major commercial project. They complimented my property, admired the view from the hill overlooking the valley, and finally placed a folder on my kitchen table containing an offer so large that my hands actually stopped moving for a moment. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in my lifetime. Enough to buy a comfortable house in town, retire without worrying about bills, and still leave something behind for the next generation. They assured me the offer would not remain available forever because several neighboring farms had already agreed to sell. One of the men smiled confidently before saying something I still remember word for word. "Mr. Walker, you're sitting on land that's worth far more as real estate than it ever will be as farmland." I looked out the kitchen window before answering. The afternoon sun stretched across the fields exactly the way it had thousands of times before. A pair of deer crossed the far pasture without noticing the strangers parked in my driveway. The wind moved gently through rows of corn that weren't yet ready for harvest. It was peaceful, almost sacred. Finally, I turned back toward the men and slid the folder across the table. I thanked them sincerely for the offer because I knew it had probably taken months to prepare. Then I quietly said, "Gentlemen, I don't believe you're trying to buy my land. I believe you're trying to buy my memories, my promises, and my family's story. Those things were never for sale." The room became completely silent. They looked at one another, almost surprised anyone would reject that amount of money. After a few more attempts to change my mind, they politely shook my hand, climbed back into their SUV, and disappeared down the gravel road. The news spread across Hartwell County before sunset. By the following morning, nearly everyone knew that old Samuel Walker had turned down what people called the opportunity of a lifetime. Some laughed because they thought pride had clouded my judgment. Others believed I had become stubborn with age. Friends tried convincing me to reconsider, explaining that nobody farms forever and that every man eventually has to know when it's time to let go. Even relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly found reasons to call, reminding me how much easier life could become if I simply signed the papers. At first, I listened politely because I knew most of them meant well. But after hearing the same arguments over and over again, I realized something. None of them were talking about what the farm meant. They were talking only about what the farm could be sold for. Somewhere along the way, people had stopped seeing land as something to care for and started seeing it as something to cash out. Life didn't become easier after refusing the offer. In fact, it became much harder. The following year brought one of the worst droughts in county history. Crops struggled beneath relentless heat. The creek shrank until rocks that had remained underwater for decades finally appeared, and every trip to the mailbox seemed to bring another bill demanding money I wasn't sure I could find. My tractor broke down halfway through planting season, forcing me to repair it myself because hiring mechanics simply wasn't an option anymore. There were evenings when I sat alone on the porch with nothing but a cup of coffee and wondered whether everyone else had been right after all. Maybe I had allowed sentiment to stand in the way of common sense. Maybe my grandfather's promise belonged to another time when farming could still support a family without constant worry. Yet every morning before sunrise, I found myself pulling on my boots once again, because giving up somehow felt harder than trying one more day. Then something happened that I couldn't explain. During one particularly dry afternoon, while repairing an old section of fence near the western pasture, I noticed fresh water bubbling gently from a part of the hillside where no spring had ever existed before. At first I assumed it was simply runoff from recent rain, but there had been no rain for weeks. Curious, I cleared away loose rocks and discovered a steady underground flow pushing crystal clear water toward the surface. I contacted the county's agricultural office, expecting them to tell me it was nothing unusual. Instead, within days, specialists arrived to inspect the area. They performed tests, took measurements, and examined geological records dating back decades. When the lead engineer finally spoke to me, his face carried the kind of excitement I had never seen before. According to their findings, the underground aquifer beneath my farm was far larger than anyone had realized, capable of supplying enormous quantities of clean water even during extended droughts. At the time, I didn't fully understand why that mattered. I simply thanked them and continued repairing my fence, believing the discovery was interesting but probably not life-changing. Couldn't have been more mistaken. A few weeks later, the drought grew even worse. Neighboring ponds dried up. Wells stopped producing enough water for livestock. Irrigation systems failed across much of the county. Farmers who had laughed at me for refusing to sell now found themselves desperately searching for ways to keep their animals alive and their crops from dying. Meanwhile, because of that underground aquifer, my farm continued producing enough water to survive. I watched green fields stand beside brown ones, healthy cattle drink while others were being hauled away, and crops continue growing when almost everything around them struggled. That was the moment I began realizing my grandfather's words had never been about money. They had always been about patience, about protecting something today that the future might desperately need. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who believes some things are worth protecting even when the whole world tells you to let them go. Stay with me because what happened after the drought ended turned those same people who laughed at me into people who stood at my gate asking for something they once said was worthless. And that's where the second part of my story begins. The drought didn't end the way people expected it to. Most of us had spent months staring at empty skies, praying every dark cloud drifting across the horizon would finally bring enough rain to save what little remained of the season. But the clouds kept passing, the heat kept building, and every day the fields around Hartwell County looked a little more exhausted than the day before. I had never seen so many farmers standing silently beside dried-up ponds with their hands buried deep inside their pockets. Not because they had given up, but because they simply didn't know what else to do. It is one thing to lose money. Farmers understand that. It is another thing entirely to watch living things suffer while you stand there unable to help. That is a burden no honest farmer ever forgets. Every morning I walked across my own fields, listening to the quiet sound of water flowing from that newly discovered spring, and instead of feeling proud, I felt guilty. I kept asking myself the same question. Why had my farm been blessed while so many others were struggling? The answer came to me one evening while I watched my grandfather's old windmill turning slowly against the orange sky. Blessings were never meant to stop with the person who received them. They were meant to flow outward, The very next morning, I climbed into my old pickup truck and drove into town. I met with the county agricultural office, then with the local church, and finally with every neighboring farmer willing to listen. I told them that anyone needing water for livestock could bring their tanks to my farm without paying a single dollar. If they needed water for emergency irrigation, we would find a way to make it happen. First, nobody believed me. Some thought I was joking. Others assumed there had to be conditions attached. But there weren't. Before long, tractors pulling water tanks lined the gravel road leading to my property from sunrise until after sunset. Young men filled containers while older farmers stood quietly beneath the shade of oak trees, grateful beyond words. Volunteers began helping organize deliveries so no family was left without enough water. It didn't matter whether someone had laughed at me months earlier or argued that I should have sold my land. Out there in the fields, pride no longer mattered. Survival did. I closed the folder without even reading every page. Looking across the yard, I could see Ethan Miller, one of my neighbors, helping an elderly couple load water into the back of their trailer. A little farther away, children laughed while filling buckets for animals waiting back on their family farms. The place felt less like private property and more like a gathering place where people remembered what neighbors were supposed to do for one another. I looked back at the gentleman sitting across from me and said as kindly as I could, "A few months ago, you believed this land was valuable because of what you could build on it. Today it's valuable because it's helping people stay alive. Those are two very different kinds of wealth. I can't sell you something that so many families now depend on." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally he nodded. "Mr. Walker," he said softly, "I think I finally understand why you never signed the papers." We shook hands and he drove away. That was the last time anyone tried to buy my farm. The drought eventually broke. Late one September evening, dark clouds gathered over the county, and this time they didn't pass us by. Rain began falling slowly at first, then steadily through the night until the thirsty ground finally drank its fill. The ponds recovered. The creeks began flowing again. Fields that many believed were lost started showing signs of life. It wasn't a perfect recovery, but it was enough to give every farmer hope that another season would come. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson farming has ever taught me. No matter how difficult today becomes, tomorrow always carries another chance. Months later, the county organized a small gathering to thank everyone who had helped during the drought. I wasn't expecting anything special. I assumed we'd drink coffee, tell stories, and celebrate making it through another difficult year together. Instead, the mayor called my name and invited me to the front of the room. Looking out across that crowd, I recognized many of the faces that had laughed when I refused to sell the farm. Some smiled warmly. Others looked embarrassed. One by one they stood and applauded, not because I had become wealthy, but because I had reminded them that land can serve a purpose greater than profit. Then an elderly farmer named Walter slowly walked toward me. Walter had been one of my loudest critics. He had teased me more than once for refusing the developer's offer. When he reached me, he removed his hat, looked me in the eye, and said words I'll never forget. "Samuel, we laughed because we thought you were holding on to the past. We didn't realize you were protecting all of our future." Those words stayed with me far longer than any amount of money ever could. Today, I still wake before sunrise. I still drink my coffee on that same old porch. The farmhouse is older now, and so am I. The fences have been repaired. The barn has a new roof, and every spring the fields turn green once again. Whenever I walk to the western pasture where my grandfather rests beneath that giant oak tree, I stop for a few minutes and smile. I imagine telling him everything that happened. I imagine him nodding quietly before saying, "I told you the land would carry you someday." He was right. Not because it made me rich, but because it gave me something far more valuable. It gave me the chance to help others when they needed it most. People still drive past the farm from time to time. Some recognize me and wave. Others stop to ask whether I ever regret refusing all that money. My answer has never changed. Money can buy another house, another truck, or another piece of property. But once you sell the place that holds your family's story, you can never buy those memories back. I didn't keep this farm because I was stubborn. I kept it because some things are worth more than a price tag. If you've stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you for sharing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes doing the right thing is always worth it, even when the whole world laughs at you. And wherever you are, I pray your home is filled with peace, your table is never empty, your hands always find honest work, and your heart never loses the courage to protect what truly matters. May God bless you, keep you safe, and give you a harvest of hope in every season of your life. Until we meet again, take good care of yourself and those you love.